economic crisis, but it was clear that something much more fundamental had gone wrong. What were supposed to be institutions to help people had become destructive. Those around them seemed to have turned against the very people they were supposed to serve.
Financial restrictions.
Well, can you get him for a minute? Well, it's urgent, this.
I can't tell you that.
I'm not allowed to disclose that.
We don't deal with that sort of thing.
Not available.
A group of right-wing economists in America now put forward a theory that they said explained why this was happening. At the heart of their idea was game theory. They said that the fundamental reality of life in society was one of millions of people continually watching and strategizing against each other, all seeking only their own advantage. An assumption had become a truth. The self-interested model of human behaviour that had been developed in the Cold War to make the mathematical equations work had now been adopted by these economists as a fundamental truth about the reality of all human social interaction.
We're always trying to infer the intentions of the other. We're always trying to convey our intentions, either deceptively or truthfully. We're always trying to find ways to make believable promises, and sometimes to make believable threats, threatening the Soviet Union, threatening a misbehaving animal, threatening a child, threatening a neighbor. I think what we're doing is what we call strategizing. What does he think that I think he thinks that I think he's going to do? It has to come to some kind of equilibrium. What is it that we can both recognize is the obvious thing to do?
What this meant, the economists argued, was that the politicians and the bureaucrats' belief that they were working for what they called the public good was a complete fantasy. Because to do that depended on creating shared goals in society based on self-sacrifice and altruism. But in a world that was really driven by millions of suspicious, self-seeking individuals, such concepts could not exist. Out of this came a theory called public choice, and a group of economists who were determined to destroy the politicians' dream that they were working for the public interest. Their leader was called James Buchanan.
There's certainly no measurable concept that's meaningful that could be called the public interest, because how do you weigh different interests of different groups and what they can get out of it? The public interest, as a politician thinks it, does not mean it exists. It's what he thinks is good for the country. If he would come out and say that, that's one thing, but behind this hypocrisy of calling something the public interest as if it exists, that's what I was trying to tear down.
In 1975, Mrs. Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party, and Buchanan's ideas had a powerful influence on her and the group of radicals gathered around her. A right-wing think tank advising Mrs. Thatcher brought James Buchanan to London for a series of seminars, and he explained starkly why the British state was failing. It was pure game theory. Because there was no agreed version of the public good, the bureaucrats and the politicians schemed and strategized in their own self-interest, building up their power and their own empires. They claimed to be helping others. In fact, it was the very opposite, and the result was economic chaos and a breakdown of society.
It was chaos. There is no other word for it. And then public choice theory came along and told us why. It's because the self-interest of the groups that have managed to acquire control of the process is such that they're directing these activities to their own advantage at the expense of the rest of society. When public servants and politicians say they're pursuing the public interest, the words are those of public service, the actions are those of self-interest, maximising personal advantage.
Now, this is certainly not true because, contrary to popular belief, both myself and my staff here, we take a very, very great personal interest in individual people.
I think you're scared. I think because there won't be so much opposition, you don't know whether you're doing the right thing or not.
If you don't want me to answer, I'll go home. It's a lovely evening. I don't need to be here. But if you do want me to answer, I will stay.
Please, will you give the... Listen.
As the British economy spiralled out of control, the political and bureaucratic elite who had dominated Britain since the war found themselves under attack from both the right and the left. Where once they had been heroic figures who would create a new world, now they were accused of being agents of control, not freedom.
We've been ruled by men who live by illusions. The illusion that you can have freedom by government decree.
And these new theories began to spread into the public imagination. The writer, who was part of the group advising Mrs. Thatcher, began to write a sitcom that explicitly put forward the theories of public choice. As well as being funny, it was ideological propaganda for a political movement.
Humphrey, we have got to slim down the civil service. How many people have we got in this department? 2,000? 3,000?
About 23,000, I think, Minister.
23,000? In the Department for Administrative Affairs, 23,000 people just administering other administrators? We'll have to do a time and motion study, see who we can get rid of.
We did one of those last year, Minister.
And?
It transpired we needed another 500 people.
The fallacy that public choice economics took on was the fallacy that government is working entirely for the benefit of the citizen. And this was reflected by showing that in the programme, in Yes Minister, we showed that almost everything that the government has to decide is a conflict between two lots of private interest, that of the politicians and that of the civil servants, trying to advance their own careers and improve their own lives. And that's why public choice economics, which explains why all this was going on, was at the root of almost every episode of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister.
At the same time, R.D. Laing was continuing his assault on what he saw as the corrupt elites. He was about to use his growing power to attack one of the most powerful professions in America, the medical and psychiatric establishment. The results would be dramatic, but the outcome would be very different from what Laing intended. His ideas would undermine the all-controlling medical elite. But far from liberating people, what would actually emerge would be a revolutionary new system of order and control, driven by the objective power of numbers.
It's a space where you can meet with her, where she's not going to be frightened that you're going to put her away or that you're going to do anything to her.
Laing was now a celebrity in America and was one of the leaders of what was called the anti-psychiatry movement. Psychiatry, Laing said, was a fake science, used as a system of political control to shore up a violent, collapsing society. Its categories of madness and sanity had no reality. Madness was simply a convenient label used to lock away those who wanted to break free. Hundreds of young psychiatrists came to Laing's talks, and one of them was inspired and decided to find a way of testing whether what Laing said was true or not. Could psychiatrists in America distinguish between madness and sanity? He was called David Rosenhan, and he devised a dramatic experiment. He assembled 8 people, including himself, none of whom had ever had any psychiatric problems. Each person was then sent across the country to a specific mental hospital. At an agreed time, they all presented themselves at their hospital and told the psychiatrist on duty they were hearing a voice in their head that said the word thud. That was the only lie they should tell. Otherwise, they were to behave and respond completely normally. And then what happened?
They were all diagnosed as insane and admitted to the hospital.
All of them?
All of them.
And were any of them insane?
No. There was nobody who could have judged these people as insane. But I told friends, I told my family, I get out when I can get out. That's all. Be there for a couple of days and then I get out. Nobody knew I'd be there for 2 months.
Once admitted, all 8 fake patients acted completely normally, yet the hospitals refused to release them, and diagnosed 7 as suffering from schizophrenia and 1 from bipolar disorder. They were all given powerful psychotropic drugs. They found there was nothing they could do to convince the doctors they were sane, and it quickly became clear that the only way out would be to agree that they were insane and then pretend to be getting better.
The only way out was to point out that they're correct. They had said I was insane. I am insane, but I'm getting better. That was an affirmation of their view of me.
When Rosenhan finally got out and reported the experiment, there was an uproar. He was accused of trickery and deceit, and one major hospital challenged him to send some more fakes to them, guaranteeing that they would spot them this time. Rosenhan agreed, and after a month the hospital proudly announced that they had discovered 41 fakes. Rosenhan then revealed he had sent no one to the hospital. The effect of the Thud experiment was a disaster for American psychiatry. It destroyed the idea that they were a privileged elite with specialist knowledge. But those in charge realised that psychiatry could not just give up. Another way had to be found of understanding and managing people's inner feelings in modern society. And like R.D. Laing, they turned to the objective purity of mathematical analysis. They set out to create a scientific system of diagnosing people's inner mental states, in which all human judgment would be removed and replaced instead by a system based on the power of numbers. They gave up on the idea that they could understand the human mind and cure it. Instead, American psychiatry created a new set of measurable categories that were only based on the surface behaviour of human beings. Many were given new names, like attention deficit disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder.
Psychiatry says we don't know the causes for any of these conditions, and then just said, this is what they look like. This is what depression looks like. This is what ADHD looks like. This is what PTSD looks like. This is what multiple personality looks like. Whether they exist in any particular way, or they exist in the same way, or if they are the same kinds of things, didn't matter. This is just what they look like.
What mattered was that these disorders could be observed and thus recorded. The psychiatrists created a system in which the diagnosis could literally be done by computer. The observable characteristics of each of the disorders were listed precisely, and questionnaires were then designed that asked people whether they had those characteristics. The answers were simply yes and no, so they could be asked by lay interviewers, not by psychiatrists. The computer would then decide whether people were normal or abnormal.
The lay